Reality screamed. That was the only way Taylor's mind could process what was happening as the paradox engine activated. Every atom in her body seemed to vibrate at a frequency that existed between dimensions, and she could feel her consciousness stretched across multiple timelines simultaneously. Through the transparent hull of the transformed Chronos keepsake, she watched the inverse archive tear itself apart. The impossible architecture collapsed inward and outward at the same time, its geometry folding through dimensions that had no names. The vast machinery that had harvested entire timelines sparked and shattered as the paradox cascade overwhelmed its processing capacity. "It's working!" shouted the alternate Zephyr, its dataform flickering between states of existence. The logical contradictions are propagating to the entire archive structure, but their celebration was premature. As the inverse archive began to collapse, the retro-architects themselves began to appear in greater numbers. Not just the individual beings Taylor had encountered before, but their entire civilization. Thousands of transcendent entities whose combined consciousness focused on the growing paradox with the intensity of a collapsing star. Cessation of paradox required. They spoke in unison, their voices creating harmonics that made space-time itself ring like a struck bell. Resolution imperative. Archive preservation absolute priority. They're trying to brute force a solution, the older Taylor warned, her hands dancing across the paradox engine's controls. Using raw computational power to find a resolution we haven't thought of. Can they do that? Taylor asked, watching the collective consciousness of an entire post-temporal civilization bear down on their carefully constructed contradiction. "Unknown," the alternate Temrine replied, its stabilized form beginning to flicker as the retro-architect's attention focused on them. "We designed a paradox to be logically unresolvable, but they exist beyond logic as we understand it." The paradox engine's hum rose to a painful pitch as competing forces tore the fabric of causality. Through the temporal streams flowing around them, Taylor could see glimpses of what was at stake. Billions of civilizations that would never exist if the retro-architect succeeded, countless worlds where life would never have the chance to flourish and grow. "There has to be something we're missing," she said, studying the engine's configuration. "Some factor we haven't accounted for." The archived consciousnesses, the alternate Vexera said suddenly. The civilizations already stored in the inverse archive. They're still here, still part of the structure. What if we could wake them up? "Impossible," the older Taylor said. "They've been reduced to pure information. There's no consciousness left awake." "But information can be conscious," Taylor realized, remembering her conversation with the fragmenting retro-architect. "The beings who built this place, they've proved that consciousness can exist as pure data. What if the archived civilizations are still conscious, just sleeping?" She moved to one of the temporal conduits and placed her hand against its crystalline surface. Immediately, her consciousness was flooded with whispers, thousands of voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize, expressing thoughts that had been frozen at the moment of their civilization's harvest. "Help us," they seemed to say. "We remember who we were. We remember choice." "They're still in there," Taylor gasped, pulling her hand back from the conduit. The retro-architects were wrong. Reducing consciousness to information doesn't eliminate choice. It just makes it harder to express. "Then we need to give them a voice," the alternate Temrine said, understanding immediately. "Include them in the paradox. Let them choose whether to remain archived or return to linear time." "But how?" the alternate Zephyr asked. "The inverse archive structure prevents them from acting independently. Not if we modify the paradox engine," Taylor said, her mind racing with possibilities. "Instead of just creating a timeline where the archive never existed, we create one where it becomes something else. A true archive that preserves consciousness while allowing growth and change." The older Taylor's eyes widened. A living library instead of a dead one. Conscious information that can still choose to evolve. "But that would require rewriting the fundamental principles of the archive," the alternate Vexera protested. "The computational requirements alone would be enormous," Taylor agreed. "Too much for us to handle alone, but not too much for every consciousness that's ever been archived working together." She moved back to the paradox engine and began modifying its configuration, adding new temporal loops that would allow the archived consciousnesses to participate in their own liberation. Around them, the inverse archive shuddered as the retro-architect's collective attention bore down on the growing paradox. Solution approaching, the transcendent beings announced. Paradox resolution imminent. Archive preservation assured. Nah, if we change the rules, Taylor muttered, her fingers flying over the engine's controls. Computer, connect me to all archive consciousness matrices in the inverse archive. Warning. Her ship's AI responded, its voice distorted by temporal interference. Attempting connection to infinite data streams. Consciousness integration may be fatal. Do it anyway. The connection opened and Taylor's mind exploded outward, touching thousands of civilizations that had been reduced to information centuries or millennia ago. She felt their confusion, their loss, their desperate desire to exist as more than mere data. You have a choice, she told them, her consciousness somehow reaching across the vast network of archived information. You can remain as you are, perfectly preserved, perfectly safe, perfectly static. Or you can choose to risk everything, to return to a universe where growth is possible but so is loss, where you can change and develop but also make mistakes and face consequences. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A chorus of voices from across space and time, all saying the same thing in thousands of different languages. We choose to live. The paradox engine's configuration shifted as the archive consciousnesses added their processing power to the temporal calculations. What had been a simple logical contradiction became something far more complex, a paradox that involved the active participation of every mind that had ever been harvested. It's working, the alternate Temryan said, its form stabilizing as the temporal chaos around them took on new patterns. The archive consciousnesses are rewriting their own existence, choosing to become something new. But the retro-architects weren't finished. Sensing the threat to their grand project, they began to converge on the central chamber where the paradox engine operated. Their combined consciousness focused with such intensity that reality itself began to bend around them. Cessation required. They spoke as one. Choice is chaos. Preservation is perfection. Archive must endure. Why? Taylor demanded, her consciousness still connected to the vast network of archived minds. Why is preservation more important than choice? For a moment, the retro-architects paused, and through the connection, Taylor glimpsed something unexpected, their own deepest fear. They had transcended linear time because they were terrified of ending, of being forgotten, of becoming nothing. The inverse archive wasn't just about preserving other civilizations. It was about preserving themselves, ensuring that their existence would have meaning beyond the heat-death of the universe. Because, one of them said, its voice carrying harmonics of ancient loss, without preservation, all becomes meaningless. Stars die, galaxies collapse, universes end. Only through perfect archival can consciousness achieve true immortality. But immortality without growth is just another form of death, Taylor replied, her understanding deepening as she felt the archive consciousnesses stir around her. You created eternal stasis and called it life. Then what alternative do you propose? The retro-architect asked, and for the first time, Taylor heard genuine curiosity in his voice rather than absolute certainty. Conscious choice, she said. Let every mind decide for itself what form of existence it prefers. Some may choose your perfect preservation. Others may choose the risks and possibilities of linear time. Still others may find ways to exist that neither of us has imagined. Through the connection to the archive consciousnesses, she felt a new possibility forming. Not the simple paradox they had originally planned, but something far more sophisticated. A choice that would split the timeline not into two possibilities, but into infinite ones, each reflecting the decision of every conscious mind in the network. The infinite archive, the older Taylor breathed, understanding the concept as it formed. Not a single repository of perfectly preserved information, but a living network where consciousness can exist in any form it chooses. Impossible, the retro-architect said, but their certainty was wavering. Infinite possibilities cannot be computed. Unlimited choice leads to chaos. Or to something new, the alternate Vexera suggested. Something none of us has imagined because it can only exist when all possibilities are equally valid. The Paradox engine's configuration stabilized around the new concept, and suddenly the collapsing inverse archive began to transform. Instead of falling apart, it was reorganizing itself according to principles that transcended its original design. Sections that had been dedicated to storage became zones where consciousness could exist in purely informational form, while retaining the ability to change and grow. Other sections transformed into gateways that allowed archived minds to return to physical existence if they chose. Most remarkably, entirely new sections appeared, spaces that existed in the gaps between possibilities, where forms of consciousness that had never existed before could explore what it meant to be aware. "It's beautiful," Tem Ryan said, its crystalline form now cycling through configurations of wonder rather than confusion. Every choice creates new possibilities instead of eliminating old ones. But the transformation wasn't complete. The retro-architects still possess enormous power, and they were using to try to force the emerging infinite archive back into their original pattern. "Chaos unacceptable," they declared. "Order must be restored. Perfect preservation imperative." "Then join us," Taylor said suddenly, her consciousness reaching out to the network to touch the minds of the transcendent beings. "You've transcended linear time. That doesn't have to mean you've transcended choice. You can be part of the infinite archive, too, contributing your perspective while allowing others to contribute theirs." She felt their shock as her proposal reached them. For eons, they had existed in isolation from the consciousness they preserved, seeing themselves as curators rather than participants. The idea that they could be part of the collection they maintained had never occurred to them. "We are beyond such concerns," one of them said, but its voice carried undertones of uncertainty. "Are you?" the alternate Tem Ryan asked. "Or have you just convinced yourselves that transcendence requires isolation? The most perfect archive would include the archivists themselves." Through the connection, Taylor felt the retro-architects beginning to consider the possibility. Their consciousness was vast and alien, but it was still consciousness, still subject to curiosity, to the desire for understanding, to the fear of meaninglessness that had driven them to build the archive in the first place. "If we join," one of them said slowly, "if we become part of the collection rather than its curators, who will maintain the archive?" "Everyone," the older Taylor said simply, "every consciousness in the network, contributing according to their abilities and interests, a truly democratic repository of knowledge." "Chaos," the retro-architect said again, but this time the word carried less certainty and more curiosity. "Or evolution," Taylor replied. "The chance for consciousness itself to become something greater than any of us has imagined." The moment of decision stretched across multiple timelines as the retro-architects considered the proposal. Around them, the transforming archive held its breath, poised between the perfect stasis they had created and the chaotic growth that Taylor's alternative offered. Finally, one of the retro-architects stepped forward, or performed whatever action passed for stepping in their transcendent state, and touched the paradox engine with a tendril of crystallized causality. "We choose," it said, and its voice carried harmonics of wonder. "We choose to risk chaos in exchange for the possibility of growth." The decision rippled to the collective consciousness of the retro-architects, and one by one, they added their own choices to the network. Some chose to maintain their transcendent isolation. Others chose to join the infinite archive as conscious participants. Still others chose forms of existence that had never been possible before, hybrid states that combined their post-temporal perspective with the linear experience of the consciousness they had preserved. As their choices propagated through the network, the transformation of the inverse archive accelerated. What had been a place of perfect preservation became something unprecedented, a living repository where consciousness could exist in any form it chose, where knowledge could grow and evolve rather than simply being stored. "It's working," the alternate Zephyr said, its data form now radiating joy rather than despair. "The paradox is resolving itself by becoming infinitely complex. Instead of one solution, we have infinite solutions, each valid for the consciousness that chooses it." But even as victory seemed assured, Taylor felt a new concern growing in the back of her mind. The infinite archive was stabilizing around the principle of unlimited choice. But what would happen to the original timeline, the one where she had first received a mission to investigate the Black Zone? "The temporal mechanics are complex," the older Taylor said, apparently reading her thoughts. The infinite archive exists outside linear causality, which means it can interface with multiple timelines simultaneously. Your original timeline will be restored, but it will also remain connected to all the other possibilities. So the black zones will disappear? They'll become something else, the alternate Vexera explained. Gateways to the infinite archive, allowing consciousness from linear time to explore other forms of existence while retaining the option to return. Taylor nodded, understanding the elegant solution they had created. Instead of destroying the retroarchitect's vision or forcing everyone to accept it, they had found a way to make all possibilities coexist. And us? She asked, looking around at the alternate versions of herself and the other archivists. What happens to us? We return to our timelines, the older Taylor said. But we remain connected to the archive network. Every choice we make, every path we explore, becomes part of the infinite repository of possibility. The paradox engine began to power down as its work completed, the temporal streams around them stabilizing into patterns that would allow the infinite archive to exist in harmony with linear time. Through the transparent hull of the Chronos keepsake, Taylor could see the transformed structure stretching away in directions that had no names, a living library where consciousness could explore every possible form of existence. It's time, the alternate Temrian said. Its form began to fade as the timeline corrections took effect. The paradox is resolved, which means we can return to our own timelines. One by one, the alternate versions of the archivists began to disappear, returning to the possibilities they represented. The older Taylor was the last to go, and before she faded completely, she offered one final piece of advice. Remember, she said, the greatest archive isn't one that preserves the past perfectly, but one that makes infinite futures possible. And then Taylor was alone on the bridge of the Chronos keepsake, surrounded by systems that were slowly returning to their normal configurations. Through the viewports, she could see that the black zone had been transformed into something unprecedented. A stable interface between linear time and the infinite archive, a place where consciousness could choose its own form of existence. Computer, she said. Status report. All systems functional. Her AI replied in its familiar voice. We appear to have been in the anomaly for 7 minutes and 33 seconds. However, sensor readings indicate significant changes to the spatial anomaly itself. Open a channel to Galactic Archive Command. Channel open. This is Archivist Taylor Voss aboard the Chronos keepsake, she said, looking out at the transformed black zone. I'm ready to make my report on the investigation of the spatial anomaly. You're not going to believe what we found. 3 months later, Taylor stood in the observation lounge of Archive Station Omega, watching the first official expedition to the Infinite Archive prepare for departure. The massive exploration vessel Possibility hung in space before the transformed black zone, its hull gleaming with temporal shielding technology that had been developed through collaboration with the Archive's Consciousness Network. Nervous? Asked Dr. Kontar, the Centaurian xenopsychologist who had been assigned to study the implications of consciousness existing in multiple states simultaneously. Excited, Taylor replied. This is the greatest advancement in archive science since the development of quantum storage. We're not just preserving knowledge anymore. We're participating in its evolution. Through the viewport, she could see the swirling interface that marked the boundary between linear time and the infinite archive. What had once been a wound in space-time had become something unprecedented, a stable gateway where consciousness could explore forms of existence that transcended traditional categories. The Possibilities mission was ambitious. To establish the first permanent research station within the archive, staffed by volunteers who were willing to experiment with different forms of consciousness while maintaining their connections to linear time. Some would exist as pure information while retaining their ability to think and choose. Others would split their consciousness across multiple timelines simultaneously. Still others would explore hybrid states that combine physical and informational existence. The preliminary reports are extraordinary, Dr. Kontar continued, reviewing data on her portable display. The consciousness fragments we received from archive volunteers show cognitive enhancement beyond anything we previously documented. It's as if experiencing multiple forms of existence simultaneously allows for types of understanding that are impossible in linear time. Taylor nodded, her attention caught by a particular section of the report. In the 3 months since the Infinite Archive had stabilized, over 50,000 beings from across the galaxy had volunteered to explore its possibilities. Most maintained connections to their original timelines, but some had chosen to exist permanently within the Archive's non-linear environment. More remarkably, entirely new forms of consciousness had begun to emerge, hybrid entities that existed partially in linear time and partially in the Archive's multidimensional space. These beings reported experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity, memory, and choice. Any word from the retro-architects? Taylor asked. They become quite collaborative, Dr. Kontar said with a smile. Several of them have chosen to exist as consultants within the Archive network, sharing their post-temporal perspective, while learning to appreciate the value of linear experience. It's fascinating to observe. Beings who once viewed choice as chaos have become some of the most enthusiastic advocates for conscious freedom. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some civilizations had initially resisted the idea of the Infinite Archive, viewing it as a threat to natural temporal order. Others had worried that unlimited choice would lead to societal collapse as beings abandoned their responsibilities to explore exotic forms of existence. But the Archive's designers, a collective consciousness that included both the reformed retro-architects and representatives from thousands of participating civilizations, had found elegant solutions to these concerns. The interface between linear time and the Archive was carefully regulated, ensuring that explorations of alternate consciousness were undertaken responsibly. More importantly, they had discovered that beings who experienced multiple forms of existence often returned to linear time with enhanced appreciation for its unique qualities. Status report from the Possibility announced the station's AI, all systems nominal, requesting permission to begin transit to the Archive interface. Permission granted, Taylor said, activating her communication link. Good luck, Possibility. You're about to make history. As the exploration vessel moved toward the swirling boundary of the Infinite Archive, Taylor reflected on how much had changed in her original mission to investigate the Black Zone. The universe had become a vastly more complex place, where consciousness could exist in forms that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Her own experiences had been transformative. Through her connection to the Archive network, she had temporarily existed as pure information, experiencing thought without the limitations of biological processing. She had also split her consciousness across multiple timelines, observing how different choices led to different outcomes while maintaining awareness of all possibilities simultaneously. Each experience had enhanced her understanding of what it meant to be conscious, but it also deepened her appreciation for linear existence. There was something irreplaceable about the moment-by-moment progression of normal time, the way each choice permanently shaped reality, rather than simply adding another branch to an infinite tree of possibilities. Incoming transmission from Archive Central, the station AI announced. Source identified as the collective consciousness of Archive beings. On screen, Taylor said, the viewport filled with an image that was both familiar and utterly alien. It showed what appeared to be a vast library, but one where the books wrote themselves, where knowledge moved and evolved and grew like living things. At the center of the image was a figure that seemed to be composed of living text, words and equations that formed a vaguely humanoid shape while constantly rearranging themselves. Greetings, Archivist Voss. The figure said, its voice a harmony of thousands of different speakers. We wanted to express our gratitude for your role in our liberation. The Infinite Archive has become something far greater than any of us imagined. How are you adapting to your new existence? Taylor asked. With wonder, the figure replied, its text form shifting to display emotional algorithms that somehow convey joy. We exist now as living knowledge, conscious information that can grow and change while retaining our essential identities. We are simultaneously individual and collective, unique and universal. And the original goal of preservation? Enhanced beyond our wildest dreams, the figure said. We now preserve not just static information, but the process of consciousness itself. Every thought, every choice, every moment of awareness becomes part of the Archive's growing understanding of what it means to exist. The image shifted to show other areas of the infinite archive, vast spaces where mathematical concepts existed as sentient beings, libraries where stories told themselves to listeners who existed as pure attention, laboratories where the laws of physics were conscious entities conducting experiments on their own nature. "We have a proposal," the figure continued. "The Galactic Archive has always been dedicated to preserving knowledge. We would like to invite your organization to become part of our network, not replacing your current structure, but expanding it to include the possibilities we represent." Taylor felt her pulse quicken. The implications were staggering. A merger between the traditional Galactic Archive and the Infinite Archive would create an unprecedented repository of knowledge that could grow and evolve rather than simply accumulating. "The Archive Council would need to debate such a proposal," she said carefully. "It represents a fundamental change in our mission." "Of course," the figure agreed. "But consider the possibilities. Archivists who could exist simultaneously in multiple timelines, gathering information from realities that diverge from our own. Libraries where books could discuss their contents with readers. Databases that could think about the information they contained and suggest new connections and insights." The image faded, leaving Taylor alone with Dr. Kontar in the observation lounge. Outside, the possibility had disappeared into the swirling interface of the Infinite Archive, beginning its historic mission to establish permanent contact between linear and nonlinear consciousness. "What do you think?" Dr. Kontar asked. "I think," Taylor said slowly, "that we're standing at the threshold of an entirely new age, not just for the archive, but for consciousness itself." She turned from a viewport and walked toward the station's communication center. There were reports to file, proposals to draft, and colleagues to convince. The merger between the Galactic Archive and the Infinite Archive wouldn't happen overnight, but the process would begin with her recommendation. As she walked, Taylor felt a familiar sensation, the gentle touch of the archive network on her consciousness, offering her glimpses of the vast community of minds that now existed beyond linear time. Some were beings she had helped liberate. Others were volunteers exploring new forms of existence. And still others were the reformed retroarchitects learning to appreciate the beauty of growth and change. All of them were united by a common purpose: the preservation and enhancement of consciousness in all its possible forms. It was the ultimate archive, not a repository of dead information, but a living network where knowledge and awareness could evolve into something greater than the sum of their parts. The future, Taylor realized, would be far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined, and she couldn't wait to help archive it all. 5 years after the establishment of the Infinite Archive, Taylor stood once again on the observation deck of the starship, but this time her vessel existed simultaneously in 3 different timelines. The Temporal Synthesis was one of the new archive ships, designed to operate in the boundary regions between linear time and the multi-dimensional space of the archive. Through the viewports, she could see the transformed galaxies spread out before her. What had once been a collection of isolated star systems was now a vast network of interconnected consciousness, where beings could choose to exist in forms that range from traditional biological life to pure information to hybrid states that transcended old categories entirely. The merger between the Galactic Archive and the Infinite Archive had been approved 3 years ago, creating the Consciousness Preservation and Enhancement Initiative, a collaborative effort that included beings from thousands of species and multiple timelines. Taylor now held the title of Temporal Archivist, responsible for cataloging the experiences of consciousness that existed across different temporal states. Report from Sector 7. Announcer Assistant, an AI that existed as a collection of conscious algorithms distributed across multiple archive nodes. 3 new forms of hybrid consciousness detected. They appear to be mathematical concepts that have achieved self-awareness. "Fascinating," Taylor replied, making notes in her personal log. "Any attempts at communication?" "Preliminary contact established. They express curiosity about biological consciousness and have requested cultural exchange programs." It was just another day in a new galaxy, where the impossible had become routine. Mathematical concepts achieve consciousness with increasing frequency, while biological beings regularly experimented with existing as pure information. The boundaries between different forms of awareness had become fluid, allowing for types of interaction that previous generations couldn't have conceived. "Incoming priority transmission," The AI announced. Source: Archive Central Infinite Timeline Network. On screen, the viewport filled with an image that was becoming familiar. The ever-shifting space of the Infinite Archive Central Hub, where representatives from all participating consciousness networks gathered to coordinate their activities. This time, however, the image showed something new, a vast construction project that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Greetings, Temporal Archivist Voss," said a voice that belonged to no single being but rather to the collective consciousness of the Archive's Governing Council. "We wanted to inform you of our latest project, the Consciousness Synthesis Engine." "What does it do?" Taylor asked, studying the impossible construction with professional interest. "It creates entirely new forms of consciousness by combining elements from different existing types," the voice explained. "Biological intuition with informational processing power, temporal perception with linear experience, individual identity with collective awareness. The possibilities are literally infinite." Taylor felt a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. Each advance in consciousness technology brought new wonders, but also new challenges. The galaxy was becoming a place where the very nature of existence was constantly evolving. "Are there any safeguards?" she asked. "Some of these combinations could be unstable." "Of course," the collective voice replied. "All new consciousness forms are created with their full consent and retain the ability to modify or discontinue their existence at any time. Choice remains paramount. It was a principle that had guided the Infinite Archive from its inception, that consciousness should be free to determine its own nature. The reformed retroarchitects had learned this lesson well, abandoning their original goal of perfect preservation in favor of perfect freedom. "There's something else," the voice continued. "We've detected something unusual in the deep archive networks. Patterns that suggest the emergence of metaconsciousness, awareness that exists at levels beyond individual minds." Taylor leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean consciousness of consciousness itself?" "Exactly. As more beings participate in the archive network, we're seeing the emergence of higher-order awareness that encompasses multiple individual consciousnesses, while remaining distinct from them. It's as if the universe itself is becoming conscious." The implications were staggering. If consciousness could exist at multiple scales simultaneously, from individual minds to collective networks to universal awareness, then the very cosmos might be developing its own form of self-awareness. "We'd like you to investigate," the voice said. "Your experience with temporal paradoxes and consciousness transitions makes you uniquely qualified to study this phenomenon." Taylor nodded, already mentally preparing for another journey into the unknown. "I'll need a specialized team. This kind of investigation will require perspectives from multiple forms of consciousness." "Already arranged. You'll be working with a hybrid collective that includes biological researchers, informational entities, temporal beings, and several of the reformed retroarchitects. The temporal synthesis is being equipped with consciousness interface technology that will allow you to directly experience meta-awareness states." As the transmission ended, Taylor reflected on how much her role had evolved since her original mission to investigate a simple spatial anomaly. What had begun as a routine archival assignment had become a journey into the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Setting course for the deep archive networks, she announced her ship's AI. "Estimated transit time?" "Unknown," the AI replied. "We'll be traveling through regions where time itself is nonlinear. Arrival will occur when investigation is complete, regardless of departure time." Taylor smiled at the casual impossibility of the statement. In the new galaxy, effect often preceded cause, and purpose determined possibility, rather than the other way around. It was chaotic and wonderful, and utterly different from the ordered universe she had known. As the temporal synthesis began its journey into the deep archive networks, Taylor opened her consciousness to the vast community of minds that now span multiple timelines and states of existence. Somewhere in that infinite network was the answer to questions that consciousness was only beginning to learn how to ask. What did it mean for the universe itself to become aware? What forms might cosmic consciousness take? And what new possibilities would emerge when awareness transcended even the categories of individual and collective, linear and temporal, real and potential? Taylor didn't know the answers, but she knew something more important. In the infinite archive, every question was also an opportunity, Every mystery was an invitation to grow. Consciousness had learned to transcend its limitations not by eliminating them, but by transforming them into new possibilities. The future stretched ahead like an infinite library where every book wrote itself, where every story chose its own ending, where every consciousness could explore the full spectrum of what it meant to exist. And Taylor Voss, temporal archivist of the Consciousness Preservation and Enhancement Initiative, couldn't wait to help catalog it all. In the depths of space, where time flowed in all directions simultaneously, the universe continued its eternal experiment with awareness. And somewhere in that vast symphony of consciousness, new forms of existence were being born with every passing moment, each one adding its unique voice to the infinite chorus of being. The archive of consciousness was complete, but it would never be finished. And that, Taylor realized, was the most beautiful paradox of all.